Hi, my name is Annabelle. Welcome to the session on Unleashing the Leader Within. I want to talk to you today about being remarkable in every interaction, whether that's interaction with team members or customers or colleagues. So let's start though with looking at my definition of success. I borrowed this definition of success from John Wooden, the coach of UCLA. His definition is the peace of mind attained from attempting to do the best of which you're capable, but I prefer to define success as the peace of mind attained from attempting to be the best of which we are capable every single day. And of course, a day is made up of a series of moments. So remarkable in every interaction is about attempting to be the best of which you're capable in every interaction. Let me share some statistics with you. These are statistics which came from the 2010 Harvard study. So the first statistic you'll see on the screen is that 47% of the time we are lost in thought. That means that almost half of our lives we are simply lost in thought. No constructive thinking going on there at all. If you've ever had the experience of driving from A to B and having arrived you've no recollection of the journey, then the chances are that you were lost in thought. The other statistic that comes out of the Harvard study is that 65% of our thinking is either negative or redundant. That means that 65% of our thoughts were either ruminating about a past that we cannot change, thinking about a conversation which irritated us that's in the past, or worrying about some future event, not in a constructive way, but rather just belly aching over it. And the next statistic I want to share with you is rumoured to be that 90% of the thoughts that you have today will be the same as the thoughts you had yesterday. So if we have somewhere between 60 and 70,000 thoughts a day, 54,000 thoughts that you have today will be the same as the thoughts you had yesterday. And that's because most of us just wander from moment to moment in an unconscious state, hardly ever consciously engaging our thinking so as to get the best out of ourselves in every moment. So this is your chance to change that approach and to whack that 90% figure right down so that you can be the best of which you're capable in every interaction. Let me share though this model with you. I want you to look at the top box on the screen. And what I mean by perspective and focus is that either in relationships we make assumptions about people, we develop perspectives about them fairly quickly. In fact, statistics show that we start to form impressions of people we've just met within 3 seconds of meeting them. Our brain tries to figure out who they remind us of. The brain tries to establish some kind of certainty about who this person that we've just met actually is. And once we find a level of certainty based on no evidence at all, then we tend to fix that as the filter through which we see the person, and therefore the filter through which we pick up any information about them. Focus is something slightly different, and that's about life events or experiences that we're focusing on right now. So if you've ever had the experience of buying a new car, for example, let's say you had your heart set on a Mini Cooper S. And from the moment you decided you wanted to buy a Mini Cooper S, I bet you noticed many more of them on the road. Now that's not the universe delivering lots of minis so that you can see what they look like, but rather it's your focus determining what you notice. So we have somewhere between 70,000 and 110,000 pieces of information which come firing at us every single day, if you're the average person, that is. We are only able to consciously process 10% of that information. So that 10% of the available information we're able to consciously process. Now, that causes problems in relationships, and it's an explanation for why we noticed all the Mini Coopers on the road. If we have developed a fixed perspective about someone, whether it's a colleague or a customer, even during a short call, remember within 3 seconds we can develop a perspective about a customer who's on the call. And if that becomes our fixed thinking, then that's the lens through which we will experience them. That's the 10% that we will focus on. So if the customer struck us as difficult or reminded us of someone else who was difficult, then we will have labelled them as difficult, and that will be the perspective which will determine what we notice, otherwise known as confirmation bias. That's thanks to the reticular activating system that sits at the base of your limbic system. So let's stick with the relationship example. We've got the customer on the call. We're having a conversation. Of course, everything we're picking up is through our words and our tone. And we're noticing everything about the customer's tone or words which are consistent with our view of them as being difficult. So that when they go silent for a moment, we're going to immediately jump to the conclusion, the thinking, that they're not happy. So that's the thought box at number 3. So we have a perspective that determines what we filter in, and then that triggers thinking, which is of the same flavour as the original perspective that we were hanging on to. Now, every thought that we have fires a neuropeptide, which we know and we call an emotion. So every thought we have fires a feeling consistent with that thought. So if we're thinking that the client, the customer, has gone silent because they're annoyed, we may feel a sense of concern or irritation depending on the perspective that we're taking. But then that drops out into our behaviour. And of course, in face-to-face communication, the components of our behaviour are words, tone and body language. On a call, the components of our behaviour are simply words and tone. Now, in face-to-face communication, where our thoughts are not congruent with our words and our tone and our body language, the majority of the meaning that's taken from what we're saying is from our tone and our body language. So let's imagine that we're now having a face-to-face with one of our colleagues, and we think our perspective on our colleague is that they're difficult, they're out to undermine us. Then if that thinking is present in the interaction, and yet we're having a discussion with a colleague where we're pretending that we are being warm and we're being friendly, and the words that we're using are warm and friendly, then because our thoughts are not congruent with our words, then 38% of the meaning is going to be taken from our tone, and 55% of the meaning will be taken from our body language, with only 7% of the meaning taken from our words. So that the person that we're talking to will pick up subliminally, unconsciously, what our thinking truly is. So if we really want to be remarkable in every interaction, it begins with questioning our own perspective that we've taken of an individual or what we're focusing on. Because remember, our perspective began to evolve within the 3 seconds. And then it was reinforced by evidence which was sucked in through that limited lens. So even though you think you're right, the chances are your perspective is far narrower than would be a fair or truthful perspective that you could adopt about a particular person. And I call this my spectrum of truth. So I may choose to think of a colleague as difficult, but actually if I wanted to broaden that perspective, I could also genuinely and truthfully for myself see that that colleague could be helpful sometimes, was considerate, was bright, and was cleverer than me perhaps in certain areas and might be a useful ally for me to work with on occasion. So I could broaden perspective. And simply by broadening that perspective very consciously, very deliberately, then I'm going to notice different things because my lens is going to filter in different information. My thinking is therefore going to be different. How I feel is therefore going to be different. And the chances are that my thoughts and my words and my tone and my body language are all going to be entirely congruent. And that will allow me, and only that will allow me, to be remarkable in every interaction because I want to be the best of which I'm capable in this interaction, and that means that I have to challenge my own perspectives and my own thinking to broaden that spectrum so that I can get the best out of myself and therefore get the best out of the other person during the course of that interaction. As I say, whether it's a customer on a call or whether it's a colleague in a face-to-face interaction. So Maya Angelou would say, you may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them. And this is critical. She says, if you cannot make a change, change the way you have been thinking. You might find a new solution. One of my other favourite quotes is David Foster Wallace in his book Infinite Jest, where he says, You will become way less concerned with what other people think of you when you realise how seldom they do. Now, isn't that the truth? So many of us give away our energy and our power in an interaction when we worry about what others think of us. And the truth is, of course, that no one else is purely thinking about us. They're often thinking about how we make them feel, how they compare to us, and so on and so forth. Well, here's a tip on keeping your own power. Rather than focusing on what others think of you, focusing on serving others. Because if you're really coming from a place of serving another person in an interaction, the focus is not going to be on you and what they think of you, but rather it's going to be on them and how you can help them, how you can listen to them, how you can engage with them, how you can influence them. And that shift in focus is one of the key influencing skills. It also completely changes the dynamic and the energy in an interaction. It's very, very powerful. And I call that integrative leadership. I want to just share briefly with you before we close some 6 factors that I call my 6 resilient factors. And my promise to you is this: when you're feeling off your game or you're not being the best of which you're capable, the guarantee is that it will be one of the 6 things that we're about to run through which need to be adjusted. So resilience factor number 1 is to exercise conscious choice. So you'll see on the screen ABC, and that's the Albert Ellis model, where A is the activating event and C is the consequence. So if you're in a meeting, you may say that my boss undermined me and that caused me to feel completely undermined and disrespected and devalued. But of course, it wasn't what your boss said to you that made you feel devalued. It was what you believe about what your boss said to you that made you feel devalued. Now, hang on in there for a moment, because you may believe that your boss shouldn't speak to you in that way in front of other people, that if he had an issue, he should have taken you to the side and spoken to you about the issue. You may feel undermined in front of your colleagues, but if you were to change the B, if you were to change what you believe or think about the interaction, you could choose to think, broadening your spectrum of truth, you could choose to think, my boss has had a tough morning. He's not usually like that. My colleagues know me well enough to know that I'm good at what I do and they respect me. And they will have seen the interaction for what it is. Now, choosing that thinking, exercising conscious choice in choosing that thinking, take the heat out of the interaction and will make you much more influential and in your own power when you go to tackle your boss about the way you were spoken to. Resilience factor number 2 is to be actively aware of your thinking. So that if you think about a Sky News screen and the ticker tape that runs along the bottom, that's your thinking. Please do not believe everything that you think. Much of it arises from unconscious programming and is not a true reflection of who you are today, the mature adult self who's capable of being the best that they can be in every single moment. So be very wary of your thinking and choose thinking or a spectrum of thinking, a perspective that is the most resourceful and empowering for you and the relationship. Resilience factor number 3 is realistic optimism, and I want to just talk to you about a Canadian study that was carried out with a number of female maths students. Now, the group was divided into 2, and the first half of the group was given a mocked-up research paper which said that men were genetically predisposed to being better at maths than women. And the second half of the group was given a mocked-up research paper which said that men were understood to be better at maths than women, but that was only because the teachers who had taught them in the past believed that men were genetically predisposed to being better at maths than women. Now, the women who'd read the first research paper, believing that there was nothing they could do and that men were simply genetically predisposed to being better, did far worse in the maths exam that followed than the second group, who understood that it wasn't a genetic predisposition but rather old programming by teachers who had certain belief systems from the past. So the point is that we positively prime ourselves or negatively prime ourselves every moment of every day. That thought you have just before you go into the meeting, oh God, this is going to be a nightmare, that's negative priming. The thought you have just before you go on the call, I like this customer and I'm going to be able to positively influence them, that's positive priming. If you're a leader, you will be positively or negatively priming everyone in your team. So the power of how you think in terms of positively priming yourself for every interaction is absolutely critical, and another good reason to be aware of your thinking and keep an eye on it. Fourth resilience factor is being clear about your needs and boundaries, because we are not telepathic. So work out what you need, work out what your team needs, work out what the customer needs, and try and find a balance between the two. Remember to ask where your needs to be met, but being conscious about the balance that needs to be struck. Let me give you a little example. I was doing a leadership session the other day, and one of the leaders came up to me during the middle of the session and said very proudly that he had an open door policy, and his team members loved it. They could come to him whenever they needed anything, and he felt that that was the right approach. And I paused a moment and eventually said, David, how does that work for you? And he said, it's a nightmare. I can't get anything done. And that's a classic example about him not being clear about what he needed, but rather valuing his team's needs above his own. And it simply comes out in resentment one way or another. We have to be clear about what we need. If you're having a conversation with a colleague and they keep checking their mobile phone and that irritates you, then that's not your colleague's fault if you don't ask for what you need, which is their undivided attention during the course of this conversation. Also set clear boundaries yourself and encourage members of your team to do so. The next resilience factor is understanding versus judgment, and this goes back to the 5-box model that we were talking about earlier on, where the first dotted box at the top was perspective and focus. And wherever you have a fixed perspective and focus, it will restrict your lens. It will limit the information that you consciously process. So maintaining a mindset simply of seeking to understand constantly what the facts are, who a person is, what their perspective is, versus reaching a judgment, means that you keep an open mind and a lens which is flexible and one which ultimately will enable you to broaden your spectrum of thinking and be much more resourceful in all your interactions. Finally, please make sure you have a like-minded sounding board, someone, a colleague, a friend, perhaps someone within the business who understands the kind of pressures that you face, that you can lean on and trust, and perhaps that you can blurt on every now and then, complaining about things that have happened. But my top tip is make sure that your blurting buddy has the same outlook as you and will challenge your thinking and encourage you to challenge your thinking too, so that you can come up with a much more resilient and resourceful response to the current situation. Now, there's a way in which you can build up your resilience circuitry, and I've listed it on the slide. So here are the top tips. If you exercise for 20 minutes 3 times a week, that builds your resilience circuitry, which, by the way, is at your left frontal lobe. If you meditate or visualize, even if you concentrate on being here and now in the present moment, you're building your resilience circuitry. You can even do mindful breathing for 1 minute every single day, and you'll be building your resilience circuitry. So I would encourage you to be a conscious leader of all of your relationships, including the relationship with yourself. And for those of you who are tempted to buy my book, The True You, it's not out until June, though you can get it on my website at emmajbell.com. There are 2 exercises in that book called the Devil's Advocate exercise, which show you step by step how to broaden your spectrum of thought and how to change your thinking in particular situations. And if you're interested in material like this, then please sign up to my blog at emmajbell.com. Thank you.